My name is Gary Williams. I am the Dean of the School of Business and Leadership, and it's my pleasure to be your host here today. We have a very exciting and interesting seminar workshop ahead of you here, so we've been looking forward to this for some time. I want to just, for a very brief moment, tell you a little bit about the School of Business and Leadership, because we really want to make sure that you get a full understanding of the fact that we can be a resource for you, and we want to be a resource for you. The School of Business and Leadership has about 25%, 23, 24, 25% of the students in Dominican University. And it is a very active program with a large undergraduate program, 3 MBA formats, one in strategic leadership, one in global management, and the largest graduate program in Dominican University is our Green MBA program, which, by the way, was the first Green MBA program in the country and perhaps in the world. We're not sure about the world, but we certainly are sure about the country. Many of our students serve as interns to businesses in the area. We'd like to see a lot more of them out there. They can be of great help to you. Thanks, Kevin. And also, there are a number of other activities within the school, some of which you may be more familiar with than others. Our Institute for Leadership Studies is one of the most active programs in Marin County, and has not only a certificate program in leadership, but a number of programs of benefit, we think, in every instance to the business community. And is also responsible for a huge number of speakers who are brought to campus and are open. The meetings are open to the public. People like Al Gore and Madeleine Albright and Paul Hawken, and it goes on and on and on and on over the years. I'm sure you have seen many of the ads for those programs, and they have been well attended, and they have been very, very valuable. Dominican is also unique in that it hosts a center sponsored by the Environmental Protection Association, the Environmental Finance Center in Region 9, and it has been here now for several years, works closely with the Green MBA program, and is responsible for a number of activities associated with environmentalism and sustainability. We do a lot of work with Indian tribes, for instance, in this area. It's an exciting program to be around. If you read about some of the things they've done, I find it rather fascinating. We also house 2 members of the United States Commercial Service in our school, and their responsibility is to work with the community and in the international environment, primarily in the area of small business. And they can be, I think, of enormous help and assistance in this area. They're very skilled people. Denise, have I forgotten anybody? I think that's it, huh? We would encourage you very much to think about our school when you think about a possible resource to help you with your business. We would like very much to be a partner with you. So welcome. We're delighted to have you here. This workshop was conceived by Joe Destine. Now, it's one thing to have a member of your advisory council who comes up with an idea. It's another one who comes up with the idea and then works his head off to make sure it happens. He's been an absolute delight to work with. I don't know of anybody who's put more energy into anything than he has in this one. So I'd like to bring to the podium, please, Joe. Joe, just please.
I'd also like to welcome you. I'm on the Business Advisory Council to the business school, and I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And one of the reasons I do it is I just love to come on this campus. Now, all of you, when you came in, I don't know about you, but I get this wonderful feeling of some kind of a spiritual, intellectual, renaissance for me. It's just a really great place to be. So that's one of the reasons I got involved with Dominican. But now that I'm here and I get to see all the different people, I've met the faculty and the administration people, it's just a really, really great place. So we've encouraged them to the business school to get involved more with the business community, and that's why they're creating an entrepreneurship series, and this presentation is going to be the first part of this entrepreneurship series. And one of the reasons we did it is because there's what's going on in the world is the economic conditions are changing very rapidly. It's really being very stressful for a lot of people, and especially a lot of the baby boomers. And so we sort of picked a topic that would be relevant to that group. Now, in your folders, we have a sheet that asks you a very simple question. When you heard about this seminar and thought about it, what were the expectations you had when you came here? Could you just write down one or two things about why you came and what you expect? Because when the speakers are talking, we want to be able to give them an idea of what that is to make sure that they're addressing what you're interested in. The format that we're going to use today is we have 4 speakers. We're going to have 2 speakers talk, and then we're going to take a break, a 15-minute break, so you can network a little bit and have a little more coffee. And then we're going to have 2 more speakers, have another 15-minute break, and then have a Q&A session after that. So the topic today, you've built a great business, now what? And as I had mentioned before, there are about 80 million baby boomers in the United States. And of those 80 million baby boomers, about a little less than 10% own shares of privately held companies. There was a study that was done by Pricewaterhouse, Marquette University, and Mass Mutual to study this group and the ownership of the stock. And what they discovered is the stock they hold is worth about $10 trillion. And the other thing they found out about these baby boomers is that 75% of them have absolutely no plan as to how they're ever going to get liquidity out of this stock. And that's one of the reasons we're here today. We want to talk about perpetuation and succession. Now, some of you here have absolutely no interest in selling your companies right now. You're thinking more in terms of maybe down the road you're going to do this. Other people might be interested in really considering right now, over the very short period of time, over the next 2 or 3 years, being able to move out of the company. But it doesn't really make any difference whether you are planning to sell now or sell later. The important thing is that you have a plan, because I think all of us recognize every time I get on an airplane, the first thing I think about is what happens if the plane goes down? What's going to happen to my kids, my family? And so it's something that you never know. You could get disabled, you could get hit by a truck. You should have a succession plan and a way of perpetuating, and know that if anything ever happened to you, that there is a plan in place that's been well thought out, that's been organized, and it's ready to be carried out if anything happened to you. So succession, if you don't do anything and just say, I'll take care of it someday, means that it's really a crapshoot, because you don't know when anything's going to happen, and if anything does happen, you don't know what it's going to be. So that's one strategy. And that strategy has a certain cost to it. And you have to think about, what is the cost of absolutely doing nothing? There is a cost to that. The alternative is to create a succession plan and turn it into an investment. And there you're also going to spend some money, but that money will result in an investment. And that's sort of what our speaker is going to be talking about today, how to take a succession plan and turn it into an investment rather than just a crapshoot. Challenges you face: there are going to be people involved, there's a lot of money involved, and there are strategies that you're going to have to consider. Now, the people, there's you, and if you think about it, for most of us, you is usually the most important person. And you're thinking, to me, the most important question I ask myself is, how much freedom of action do I have as an individual? And if I'm running a company, you're working hard, you're making a lot of sacrifices, you're worrying about everybody. I would like to have freedom of action. One of the ways you have freedom of action is to have a succession plan, that you know, if I want to go off on a one-year sabbatical, I know I can take off, and I know that back home in my business, that there's a management team, an employee team that can really take over and run things while I'm gone. Not many people have that kind of freedom. Most people I know feel like, yeah, I can take off for a week or two, and as long as I have my cell phone and I have my laptop with me, I can deal with this. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to know that you've got a team back home that can take care of business if you're not there? Your family, of course, the most important thing everyone has to remember, and I was reminded of this yesterday, no matter what plan you come up with, always check with your spouse first. Because if you don't have your spouse on board with you and really supporting you, then it's not going to work. The management team, one of the most important things on the management team is you've got to make sure that you've got someone who has an entrepreneurial spirit similar to yours that could ever take over, because if you don't have some kind of real leadership, then none of this is really going to work. So you have to go back, look at who's on the bus, what seats are they in, and do we have the right people in charge of this succession plan? And of course, the employees are the other thing. Employees, some employers look at employees as employees, other employers look at them as second family. And a lot of this, of what's going to be discussed today, is really talking about employees as a second family. The financial, a lot of people have all of their assets in their company. If anything happened to that company, they pretty much do not have an estate. If anything happened to them, the company went down, which is usually what happens if a CEO or an owner of a company becomes disabled or dies, the chances of that company surviving really go down pretty quickly. So you want to be diversified and build up a nest egg with liquidity, and you've done it in a very tax efficient way. And one of the important elements of this is to find out, what is your company worth? And it would be a good idea every few years to have an appraisal, have an independent appraisal by a business leader, by a business appraiser to figure out exactly what the company is worth. Because that'll help you in a lot of your succession planning. And then, of course, if you've got a lot of financing and you've done a lot of guarantees, and then you have all of that exposure that your family and your business associates have to worry about. So all of this has to be considered in your succession plan. And which brings us to the strategic plan. My whole life, I started off business as a strategic planner, and I've been promoting that. I've promoted in all my Vistage groups for all my members to develop the strategic plans. Because whether you're planning on selling out or you're planning on staying in business for a while, you just have to have a plan. Otherwise, as Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else. So selling out, selling in, as I said before, it doesn't make any difference whether you're planning to sell right now or sell 5 years or 10 years from now. You should have a plan that considers how you would do that, and set your company up all the time to be ready to be sold, just in case it ever has to be. So we're going to be talking today about management stock ownership, employee stock ownership, and we're also going to throw in at the end a little comment about how philanthropy fits into this, because there are some interesting tie-ins between taking appreciated stock and giving it to a nonprofit and then putting it back to an ESOP. It's a really interesting way where you get these huge tax deductions. So with that said, we're going to go on to our first speaker, Russ Colombo. The way the speakers are set up, Russ Colombo from the Bank of Marin is going to talk about their ESOP. Now they have an ESOP which has about 5 or 6% of the ownership of Bank of Marin, a publicly held company. Then Mike Ray is going to talk about Swinnerton, very large, successful engineering company where the employees own approximately 50% of the company. And then we have Joe Cabral talking about Chatsworth Products, where the employees own 100% of the company. So we have a variety, and that should give you some questions about the differences of how much stock you would want to have your employees involved with. And then we have Dick Buxton is sort of the godfather of ESOPs. He was involved in the original design of the legislation that created ESOPs with Senator Russell Long, and he was also one of the co-founders of the ESOP Association, where most of the ESOP companies go for their guidance on how to run their ESOPs. So he will go back and teach us some of the basic elements of ESOPs and how they operate.
I'm the president of Bank of Marin, and we are a public company, and we have an ESOP. So it's a little different perspective. I don't know if there's any publicly traded companies represented here today, but ESOPs can be used for a lot of things, succession planning, motivation, things like that. And so I'm going to speak a little bit, give you a little overview first, and talk about the differences between a 401k and an ESOP, and what's motivation and what is employee benefit. And then we'll have questions at the end, and I guess it's at the end of all the speakers. So this is my... So first, talk a little bit about the importance of succession planning. And it's important not only for private companies, but it's really important for public companies too. It doesn't change the basic business need for succession planning. Rewards and motivation, ESOPs, 401ks. People say, why do you need an ESOP if you've got a 401k? There's a big difference, and I'm going to try and explain the differences and show you how we've used both in our organization for the benefit of our employees and for motivation. Talk a little bit about financing an ESOP, which I think someone else is also going to talk about. But as a bank, we can also finance ESOPs, and I have financed in my past. I've done financing for ESOPs, which has some real benefits from the bank's perspective in terms of cash flows and things of that nature. So there's a lot of benefits both sides, both from the company side, but also from the organization that provides the financing. There are some challenges, from my perspective, which I'm going to explain, and I'm sure everyone else will talk about more about these challenges because I'm sure I won't get them all. And summary, and then a Q&A. Okay, important succession planning for private companies. Certainly, as we've talked about, preserving the family business for future generations. If you're a privately owned company, you want to keep the business going for the future. You got to plan. How is that going to happen? I've seen in my 35 years of banking lots of private companies who have been great until there was a succession that they didn't plan for, and then the company either got sold, disappeared, whatever. So the future generations didn't have the opportunity to be involved. Some statistics which are interesting: 1/3 of private companies stay viable in the second generation. It's a pretty interesting fact. That's a pretty big drop-off. 12% in the third generation, and by the fourth, 3% are still around. So as you can see, if most of you, I think, are from private companies, it's pretty tough. Unless you plan really well, your company's probably not going to be around unless you do a real good job of planning for the future. Public companies, certainly we have the same things we have to plan for. We have to preserve the organization for the shareholders. We want to make sure that as a public company, I want to make sure the Bank of Marin is around well beyond when I'm there, and that the shareholders benefit from the continued growth and success of the organization. So we have to do that same succession planning. Management and board in public companies, and private of course, but there's a big investment in the company, and you want to make sure that you preserve that, protect that, and increase that. So now I talked a little bit, I mentioned the rewards and motivation, 401ks versus ESOPs. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about a 401k. From our perspective, what a 401k is about, and is it a motivating factor or benefit or not. Tax-deferred way of saving, company can provide a match. Everybody knows about these, of course. But it's really, from our perspective, 401k has become it's almost like health insurance. You work for a company, there's a 401k, there's a match. That's a benefit. That's not a motivation. That's not a motivator to your employees. Maybe you get a match and people think that's great, but people have come to expect that. It doesn't provide really any motivation to the employees to do more. It just it's a fact of life, so you have to have it. ESOP, however, it's a reward for the employee's hard work to succeed as an organization. So if you have an ESOP and you can provide funding to the ESOP to buy shares for your employees, the employees are engaged, they become part owners. There's a motivation to see the company succeed. The employees will share in the success of the company. employer contributions to the ESOP will be based on your company's success. And I'm speaking of, after I go through this list, I'll give you a little perspective on the way we do it at the bank and the way a public company can do it, or even a private company for that matter. It engages the employee in the long-term success of the company. And employees get paid in salaries and bonuses. Frankly, that's not motivation for the future. What we think the ESOP does is say the employees work hard because they know the continued success of the company will be good for them and will be motivation to them to work harder because they're going to share in the success. If the stock rises, then they're going to share in that. ESOPs can provide an excellent vehicle to employers and employees to transition ownership, as we all know. And people will be talking about that. Let me give you a little perspective for a few minutes about the way, as a public company, we use an ESOP. About 15 years ago now, our bank's only 20 years old, but about 15 years ago, we decided to establish an ESOP. And really the reason for that was we had a guy on our board by the name of H.C. Jackson. If you've ever seen Jackson's Hardware, it's a 100% owned company. And H.C. was a big proponent of ESOPs because that's what he did. He sold his business to an ESOP. And H.C. was a member of our board, one of the founders, and he said, this is a great way to motivate your employees. And so we really need to have, this is predated me, I wasn't at the bank at the time, but we really need to have an ESOP because that's a great way to reward the employees and get everybody engaged. And so we established an ESOP back in 1995, and the whole purpose was every year, based on the success of the company, we'd fund between 6 and 8% of employees' salaries into the ESOP and buy shares. Now, we're a public company, so it's pretty easy. We can go out in the market, and we just went out in the market and bought shares. And so people would, if you were a teller or if you were president of the bank, you'd still be sharing in the success of the business because that funding was determined by how well the bank did. And it could go as high as 8 or even 9 or 10% based on our success, and it could drop lower. And we'd make a decision each year how much to fund. But what happened was these employees who had been working hard and didn't necessarily have to be at senior management levels were gaining shares and building a lot of net worth based on the success of the bank. And so they could see it every year. And every year, we'd give them an ESOP statement. We'd show them how many shares they have, what the stock was selling for, and we'd show them how much money you have in the ESOP account. Now, we have the benefit as a public company of not having to worry about when they leave. When they leave, they can just take their shares because we're publicly traded, so they can just take the shares and do whatever they want with them. And frankly, interesting thing happened. Our ESOP ownership rose to about 8%, and then we had some longtime employees retire, and it's dropped. We had the former CEO, former CAO. They had been there since day one, and their ESOP shares had grown. So they walked out of the bank when they retired, so the ESOP ownership dropped. Another kind of interesting thing happened, and let me go back to it. We had our ESOP and our 401k plan, and I think this was the big mistake we made up front. We had them combined in one plan. And Dick's laughing already because he knows the problem. 401ks, as a 401k plan, you have to provide diversification for your employees, the ability to diversify your shares. So since they were combined in one plan, after 3 years with the bank, an employee had the right to diversify. So they could sell shares immediately. And now, that's kind of getting away from the whole point of the ESOP because you want them engaged in the business. So we had particularly younger employees who didn't necessarily understand the value because they see a few shares in an ESOP when they first start working. You really see the value as you're there for a long time. There was some diversification going on that we really didn't want to happen. So actually in this past year, we've separated the plans. And so now the ESOP, you can only diversify after 10 years with the bank and 55 years old. And it takes over a 5-year period, you can diversify up to 50%. So the whole point of the ESOP returns, ownership in the business, you can't diversify out unless you've been there a pretty long time and you're over 55 years old. So that's a mistake we made. we learned from that mistake, but now we've corrected it, so I think that's going to be good in the future. Okay, leveraged ESOP. There's certainly potential tax benefits, and I'll go through them. There's a little asterisk there because I'm not giving tax advice, so please don't take it as that. My marketing department said I had to say that or I'm going to get in trouble. So ESOP contributions can be tax deductible. Again, that asterisk, you'll see what it says. And there's a potential long-term deferral of capital gains tax when you leverage an ESOP. And so this is not considered tax advice. Please consult with your tax. So please don't say, Russ Colombo said to do this, and we had a tax problem. Don't want to do that. Okay. So I'm going to explain what those benefits are and when you can get the benefits when you do a leveraged ESOP, because there's ways to sell your business, part of your business, to the employees, have a bank finance it, and there's some significant tax advantages from many sides on it. First of all, the loan can be made to the ESOP to purchase a stock of the company. Okay, so make a loan to the ESOP, they buy 30% or more of the shares of the company. You get a valuation for a private company, you get a valuation, and then you value the company, and then you pay that price. Then you can get the company to guarantee back, so that you're really talking about the cash flows of the company, not just the ESOP. And repayment comes from annual distributions from the company to the ESOP, which are used to pay principal and interest. So bank makes a loan to the ESOP buys the shares, company guarantees the loan, and then each year there's a distribution made by the company to the ESOP, and they make their payments, which is a pretty slick deal, because all payments are tax deductible, which is interesting because the principal is too. It's got to be a certain percentage, 30%, right? 30%, I think, of the stock has to be purchased, but no, you're shaking your hand. Any leverage. Okay, any leverage. So the principal payments are pre-tax. So from the company's perspective, that's a great deal. You're getting pre-tax dollars to pay back your debt, not just your interest payments. So from a cash flow, from a financing standpoint, from a banker standpoint, that's really good. Your cash requirements just dropped. Lenders really relying on the company cash flow to repay the debt. So you're taking this ESOP, but really you're looking at the business and what the cash flow of that business is and how they can generate cash flow to pay back your debt and pre-tax, don't forget. And what you have to do, QRPs, qualified replacement properties, can be used to secure the debt, release pro rata with reduction in principal. When you do a leveraged ESOP, then the tax benefits to be maintained, you have to take those funds and buy qualified replacement property, primarily domestic stocks, tradable stocks. And what you can do as a bank too, you can the person who sold to the ESOP could actually pledge those back to the bank and then have those released as the debt is repaid. Now, some would say that doesn't really get where they want to go because you wanted to be able to take the money out. But if you're just trying to diversify and you're just trying to take money out of the business and put them into something else, you put them into qualified replacement properties, and over time you can get that released as the debt is repaid. So there's some challenges that exist. Private company is required to, when an employee departs and they have shares in the ESOP, they have to buy them back. Now, if you're a public company, for us, it's great. We just give them the shares and they go. For a private company, you have to buy them back. And every year you have a valuation, an updated evaluation of the value of the stock. So you have to pay that departing employee for those shares based on the valuation. And you have to get the annual valuation of stock to repurchase. And so there's a cost, there's an implicit cost in there that you don't necessarily know what it's going to be each year. And that's a bit of a risk because you have someone who's built up a big amount and they depart, you have to buy those shares back. So how do you come up? You got to make sure you have the money. So the bank financing, you have to do some projections that projects the repurchases, and so you have to look at your employee base and it can be a little bit tricky from the bank's perspective, depending on how leveraged the ESOP is, how much cash flow is going to be required to repurchase those shares. And of course, if you did 100%, less than 100% to the ESOP, if you have a family-owned business, you open the family business to outsiders. This is certainly a risk. This is certainly an issue. Hopefully it's the employees, so it becomes a family, as I think Joe was talking about. But you do have issues potentially of the family versus the ESOP if it's less than 100%. Say the family owns 70%, the ESOP owns 30%. You got some issues that you have to deal with. So in summary, certainly succession planning for lots of reasons, not just this, but for lots of reasons, succession planning is very important for both private and public companies. For a public company, it's critical, certainly. For the bank, we have to make sure that there's succession and somebody's going to succeed me and other people within the organization. But private companies, I think, and we get, this is something that's, as a public company, we hear it all the time. We hear it from regulators, we hear it from, lots of people, SEC, whatever. You have to have a plan in place so that you're protecting the shareholders. Private companies, the same issues exist, but it's not always planned as well necessarily. ESOPs are clearly a viable option for an exit strategy for private companies. Lots of issues which these gentlemen will be talking about, but it provides a great opportunity for the employees who are involved in the business every day to really have a big stake in what's going on and share in the success. And short of that, it can be a great motivator for the bank. That ownership, I will tell you, it's really interesting. Each year we do, at the end of the year, when we've, in the first part of the year, we give employees, we have a monthly staff meeting. The whole bank comes together, 200 people, and we give them a statement, their ESOP statement, individually. John Smith, here's all your shares, and this is what they're worth at today, at yesterday's price. And we go down, and they can see year to year, your value was last year this, your value is this year this. They can see the benefits, and it's really, they go, wow. Of course, the stock goes up, wow. It goes the other way, maybe it's not so wow, but it's a real motivation that they see now, okay, well, if somebody's working hard in the central operations and doesn't see the light of day every day, they now see the benefit of what their hard work is doing. They're sharing in that success. And so it's really great for us and can work the same way in a private company. You can have a small ESOP and you can do the same kind of funding. It's not as easy because you don't have that. They can't go to the newspaper and look up the stock price. But it can be a real motivation to your employees to share in your success. And certainly financing is available from your bank for ESOPs. As I mentioned, there are some tremendous benefits from the bank's perspective on cash flows in financing an ESOP. And I've financed a number of them in the past, and they've done very well. And employees have gotten real benefit out of doing that. So I guess there's no Q&A now. It'll be later, so I will, if you have any questions, hang on to them till we're all finished. Get ready.
So our industry is one that's changed a great deal, certainly over Swinnerton's span. This is Swinnerton in 1908, and this is a project site. This is actually a downtown medical building on Sutter Street in San Francisco. And as you can see, there's a number of white males there and not paying much attention to safety. Not a very clean job site, no hard hats, but as you can see, they're all wearing ties, so they dressed for the occasion. So definitely things have changed. So today, we're a diverse industry. We have obviously males, females. Much of our technology is behind the scenes, back rooms in India and other places overseas. The industry, certainly over the last 20 years, has really risen in a technological sense. where construction, for the most part, isn't done a lot differently today than it was done 20, 30, 40 years ago. But again, with the technology of building information modeling, things are changing every day. And certainly we play our part in having a sustainable country and world. And sustainability is huge in the construction business these days. So those are just some of the changes that have gone on industry-wide, and Swinnerton's changed also. This is a look at kind of an organization chart where we started in 1888. We've had 10 CEOs during our 120 years, but we had 5 for the first 100 years, okay, because they were family, and they worked virtually until they went to their grave. But they had some other family members that took on the company. And that changed. I think changed in about 1985. Does this have a... It does. When William Swinnerton retired, and he was kind of the last family member we had. He had a son, but was not at a senior level in the company. And that's when we repurchased his shares, which represented about 30% of the company, and we formed our ESOP. And I think one thing to note, and maybe Dick can expand on, but it was 1985, and the ESOP rules were different then. So where we still have an ESOP today, we've kind of maintained this 1985 ESOP, kept it insulated in other employee ownership we've had, because it is not subject to valuation rules. So we do not have to have an outside valuation that sets that price every 12 months that you have to live with. And that's one of my concerns, because I can never understand how these valuations are done, especially when they're looking at public companies in today's volatile stock market. We follow Perini, which is kind of a peer to us, a competitor, and it's an easy one to see because they're traded on the public market. But in a span of 3 days, their stock value went down 20%. So if that happened to be on December 31st of some year in, and then you retired, a highly profitable company, but somebody tells you they're worth 20% less than they were 3 days ago. And that's the strike price that you get paid out on. So that's something we wanted to stay away from. We do have valuations because we think it's important for communication to our employees, but we have range valuations. So we have a firm come in and they give us a range of values. And I'll explain how the rest of our stock is owned and how that ties into that in a few minutes. The other thing I think to note here is, we've obviously been through cycles in this economy. One thing we can tell our employees is we have been through adverse business cycles before. We tell them we've been through 2 world wars, a depression, and I don't know how many adverse business cycles. So that is part of our selling Swinnerton ownership, is that things may look tough today or they look tough a year ago, but we will come through it. And again, your investment in Swinnerton will continue to grow over time. In the mid-90s, we diversified. We used to be primarily a California contractor, and we expanded geographically. Coming out of the recession in the early 90s, it hit California very, very hard, and we decided we wanted to diversify geographically as well as product-wise. And we made our first acquisition in 1996, I believe it was. And that acquisition was up in the Pacific Northwest, and it was a construction company who had no succession plan. So they went out and they explored their options, but they had a culture similar to us in that the principal of the company wanted to ensure that his employees had a job and could continue, if maybe not in name of his company, continue the industry and uphold his legacy in the Pacific Northwest. So similar culture, again, a contractor without a succession plan that is, I think, redundant because most contractors don't have recession plans, especially, family-owned or individual-owned, because they're going to live forever, and most of these contractors' work is their life, is their hobby. So they stay in business and, they're forever immortal, and sometimes those decisions are made late. Once we made that acquisition, a few more almost walked through the door. Same scenario, and I won't tell you everyone was 100% successful, but overall we grew our presence geographically as well as product type through acquisitions where we were sought out by contractors who just didn't have that succession plan in place, but wanted to see their company continue. Most importantly, wanted their employees to continue in the construction business. So that was the culture match that we continue to look for. And you know, employee ownership is a great thing, but it's nothing without the employee ownership culture. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about Swinnerton is it's, again, easy to hand out stock, but if the culture isn't there, it's not going to have any real value. So our foundation has really remained the same for 120 years. This is a mission statement that we put together probably 25 years ago that kind of put our culture in a few words, and you can see that, but one of the key core values that we have is employee ownership. And even when the family owned the business, they were all working in the business, so it was employee ownership. It was just much more restricted at that time. So this is a pie chart showing the ownership history of Swinnerton. And if you look up here for our first 80-something years, we were 100% family-owned. The name of the company years ago used to be Swinnerton and Wahlberg, and there was a Swinnerton and his wife and a Wahlberg and his wife, and they owned 100% of the company. It was probably 1980, maybe a little bit before that, when senior management, probably a dozen employees, senior managers became part of the ownership of the company by buying more through personal notes some of the family stock, some of the spouses, or there was even a sister involved at that time. And then it was in 1985, as I mentioned, it was when we put our ESOP together by buying out Bill Swinnerton. So by 1990, the ESOP that started in 85 at 30% shrunk a bit to 27%. Okay, and that's just because other outstanding shares reduced. We always have tried to recycle the shares in our ESOP. So anybody leaving that owned those original ESOP shares, the company buys them back and they get recirculated to members of the ESOP. So that percentage, if we have no other people exiting the company or if we're not issuing new stock, that remains constant. But as we grew, we issued individual shares that I'll talk about in a minute that caused that ESOP to shrink a bit over time. And again, family membership started to dwindle so that by 2005, we had no family ownership in the company. All the Swinnertons, all the Wahlbergs had retired, no more children in the organization. And at that time, we were 75% owned by the management of the company, a little more than management, in that we pushed it on down, and 25% by an ESOP. So in 2005, we probably had 200 individual shareholders of the company. We have about 1,000 employees today, so about 20% at that time were individual shareholders of the company, and then the ESOP were all 1,000 of our full-time administrative staff that were owners through the ESOP. And today, we're about 47% owned, and ESOP, you know, I'll use that word, but it's really owned by our retirement plan. And the way we've worked this, I'll get to in just a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about that 53% ownership of individuals. If I can figure out which button to hit. Okay, so of the 53% of individuals, we have senior management, the top level of management in a company that owns about 60% of that 53%. And then we have some frontline management that owns about 20% and long-term employees. And again, we give out ownership to all of our employees based on a formula that I'll get to in just a moment. We feel this mix is good for us. It's a business that's a very, very risky business. And our feeling is that top management has to have a fair amount of skin in the game. Okay? Their decisions on a day-to-day basis, you know, obviously need to be the right decisions for the company. But if they have more at stake and a little more equity invested in the company, I think they're going to be decisions that aren't just based on short-term reward, but long-term succession and success for the overall organization. So that's our rationale as to why we like the mix of employee ownership through a ESOP or retirement fund, and then individual ownership where people get the opportunity for more equity over the long run. So at Swinnerton, we have, again, they kind of call them two buckets of ownership. So the individual ownership is all based on our profitability. And we have a bonus program, an annual bonus program, an incentive bonus program. And we usually, and it depends on where we are financially, usually try to take our bonuses and split them 50% into stock. So we are bonusing stock to individuals, 50% in cash. So they've got some liquid bonus that they can do what they need to, and then the rest is stock that enhances their, in essence, retirement fund, because although it's individual, they don't get it until they leave the company, which we hope is when they retire. And again, they get some cash for some liquidity. And we have broadened that program, so we now have about 350 shareholders. So it's first tied to years of service to be eligible to become an individual owner of the company. Individual ownership means you have voting rights and you vote as you would with a public company. So years of service is the first thing we look at. Years of service is varied by position in the company. So a higher level, you may have to wait a year or two to become eligible to be a stockholder. If you're an accountant, I came up through the financial ranks, so I can talk about accountants. If you're an accountant, you have to be there 10 years before a lower level accountant. It gets less after that. So we have tiered because we still think it's a kind of an exclusive club to be in, to be an individual owner of Swinnerton, so we don't want everybody to be part of that. So 30% is probably where we're at now with individual owners of our total population. And then it's tied to profitability of the company. So if we're not profitable, obviously we don't have funds for discretionary bonuses. So the only way we can add to our equity base, we aren't publicly traded, we can't issue stock if we're not making money, because most of our employees aren't going to write us a check to buy stock. We're generally going to bonus it. So we have to be profitable as a company, and then because it's an incentive program, whatever division or operation you're attached to also needs to be profitable and have this year-end incentive pool to use to pass around to your people. So that's the individual side. That's the 53% ownership in the company. And then, as I talked about, the rest of it is in our retirement program. We try to simplify it with our employees, and we may call it an ESOP all the time, or we may just call it our retirement program. But it's one bucket that has the legal differentiators so that we don't get into trouble with Department of Labor or, again, don't taint our old ESOP. But it is made up of an ESOP. We have a 401k plan, but we will match an individual's 401k withholdings in company stock. Sometimes 50% of our match will be company stock, sometimes 100% will be company stock. Again, depending on where we are from a balance sheet perspective, and I'll hit on that in a minute as to why it's important to us as a contractor to look out for a little more than just our bottom line. What they invest their 401k in, there's, like most 401ks, there's a menu of 8 or 10 different public traded vehicles that they can invest in, but the match is in Swinnerton stock. They cannot sell that Swinnerton stock. They cannot move funds from that Swinnerton stock to another, Dodge and Cox or other fund of any sort, so it stays as Swinnerton stock. And then the ESOP remains there that continues to own of that 47% retirement, about 2/3 of that, and that again we're continuing to recycle any shares that leave that company. Interesting is our retirement plan is now owned, 20% of our retirement plan of the Swinnerton stock is now owned by employees who are no longer with us. So they've elected to hang on to the Swinnerton stock even though they aren't an employee, they don't have any control over how we're doing. I'd like to think, because I think it's a good investment. It's a better investment than them trying to pick the right stocks into their 401k plan. So we benchmark our stock in a lot of different ways, but I think from a retirement plan perspective and trying to show our 1,000 employee owners how we're doing is we benchmark against the public market. So we try not to look at 1 year, although it's looked pretty good over the last 3 or 4 years, but we try to communicate to our employees that Swinnerton ownership is a long-term investment. It's not short-term. It's not liquid tomorrow. So we benchmark on a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year basis. And, I guess the bad news, good news is the public market has done horrible over the last 10 years and, 3 years even worse. And it was tough for me to find somebody who could learn how to do a graph where all the other numbers were negative. But our Swinnerton appreciation has been very positive. Now, our appreciation, again, is not subject to the volatility of Greece going bankrupt or, North and South Korea going to war or a terrorist attack. We pretty much value our stock on an adjusted book value basis, which, in other words, at the end of 2009, our stock is worth how we performed in 2009. So there's a direct correlation to what the company's worth in the real book value or value of the company. And we like that because all of our individual shareholders sign what we call a buy-sell agreement so that they're bound contractually, and that's the way we value individual shares. So the last thing we wanted was to have two valuations on a share of stock that in essence was identical. So this gets back to we have a valuation every 2 years so that our fiduciary trust who oversees the retirement plan is comfortable as a fiduciary that that value of our individual shares that's set by this adjusted book value is within a range that is provided by an outside independent appraisal. And we have not had any problems achieving that. And again, it works well for us in that I can say you as an owner of stock in a retirement plan that is more beneficial ownership, you don't get to vote, is no different than how my stock is valued or Joe next door here in the office next door is valued. So all our stock is valued the same way. So the investment has been positive. Sometimes you think you communicate too much, and every time we do an employee survey, the number one problem is you don't communicate enough. So we go out of our way to communicate employee ownership. We have what we call employee shareholder meetings, and we call all of our people, we thought we'll just call them owners, and that's not quite the case. There is a difference. So we call all of our employees employee owners. So that's kind of the buzzword around Swinnerton is everybody's an employee owner. And I'll talk about some of the benefits of that. But obviously this goes a long way to sell the Swinnerton stock versus the investment in the public market. Now we've been fortunate. We have not gone backwards for the last 20 years. And that's the real test is this market will come back. And when the market's up 10%, and Swinnerton value is flat or goes backwards, and we'll really see how well people are tied into our culture and believing in the future. So I think some of the ownership advantages, before I get to that, I think the other thing that I just want to mention is a construction company, we have banks and we need to please our bankers, but we're not a borrower and we have a pretty healthy equity, so our bank relationship is relatively strong. But the other part of our business is we have a surety company. And a surety company is really our financial guarantor. Whenever we get a project, certainly in the public sector, we have to bond that project. So the surety company has to put up what's called a performance bond, and they could provide performance guarantees on our behalf very easily up to $1 billion. So we have to have an equity that they're comfortable with that supports that. So we're always managing our equity in relationship to the revenues that we're doing and certainly the bonded revenues. So that's where we may vary. A stock match may be 50% Swinnerton stock because we're in pretty good shape. It's really a leverage ratio. And if we're starting to grow and get work and equity isn't growing as fast because of maybe some stock repurchases, then we may raise that stock match to 100% because it stays in the equity of the company. So that's something that being privately held and wanting to grow, wanting to be able to pay people when they exit the company, is you've always got to manage that revenue growth to your equity growth. So we can continue to be profitable, but if people leave the company, profitability, but equity could be declining. So that's kind of a battle we always have. So I think what we sell at Swinnerton and what we try to just embed in our day-to-day culture is an ownership mentality. And everybody has an impact on our bottom line. And we ask everybody to think like an owner. You know, easier said than done. But thinking like an owner is, you know, if you're an administrative assistant, just figure out how to do your own job more efficient, you know, less redundancies, et cetera. So we're always asking our employees to truly think like owners, be cost conscious. Anything that you do, you know, this is kind of the guilt syndrome, anything you do impacts your partner because we're all shareholders. Okay, so at the same time, challenge your partners if you see them doing anything wasteful. Ownership mentality, which is huge for us as a construction business, we have about 10 offices and are spread out throughout the western United States, is that entrepreneurial spirit. And we think you get a better entrepreneurial spirit when you're an employee owner. And those individuals that are at the top of our divisions or offices have this additional individual stock ownership. So they're truly vested in the company, and that's where that entrepreneurial spirit can come out. And that's where we attract, I think, stronger people than if we were not employee owned. And that's the retention message as well as attracting new employees. Is we get a lot of employees who want to be an owner, and they work down the street for the guy who's now 80 years old, but still going strong, is not going to give up any ownership. Or they work for the company that 5 years ago was acquired by you know, a foreign entity. So we find people who really want to be part of the ownership of the company, regardless of how big it is. It just is meaningful to them, and we find that it's meaningful when they're going out selling to clients. That I'm not Japanese owned, I'm not European owned, I'm not traded in the public market. I own part of Swinnerton, and you can bet, you know, I'm going to run your job because it impacts me, so I'm going to run it well, not just for you, but I've got a vested stake in this. And then retention. We think it's a strong retention tool. People like the culture of being part of a family, and where, you know, we tell people you're not going to get rich overnight at Swinnerton because we are a relatively conservative company. You know, if you're here 20, 25 years, you do build up a very nice nest egg over time, and that's part of what we want is long-term employees, not somebody that's here for that quick home run. And then again, the individual or the employee ownership, particularly the flexibility on how we have our ESOP and 401k, and the other piece of that I didn't mention is actually a profit sharing component where if we have very good years is we will issue more company stock or cash as a profit sharing component of that same retirement plan. So there's actually three pieces. And so with that flexibility, we can reward our employees, but in some cases the reward is stock, so it may not be as liquid to them, but they know it's helping in the future financial stability of Swinnerton. So again, I get back to just kind of closing is without the ownership culture, the employee ownership, I don't think has nearly the impact that it would otherwise. So you got to preach the culture over and over and over again. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. How many here are familiar with ESOPs? Okay, so for the rest of you, do you feel like you just took a drink out of a fire hose? We just kind of talked a lot about ESOPs and we're going to get some background on what ESOPs are when Dick talks. But what we're doing now is just giving you some of our stories, and you got to, a small minority ESOP with the bank, a 50% ESOP with Swinnerton, and then we're a 100% ESOP company. So you get just a different perspective. one of my functions now that I'm retired, I retired at the end of December 2004, is I got more engaged with the Employee Ownership Foundation. That's an affiliate of a group called the ESOP Association, and that's the trade association of ESOP companies. And the thrust of my chairmanship is to bring the knowledge of employee ownership, awareness of it, beyond the ESOP community to folks just like you. So when Dick gave me the invitation to come join you today, I was absolutely thrilled because you're exactly the audience that we're trying to reach. The philosophy that we're working under, or the methodology, I guess you'd call it, is to start with awareness, which is what we're doing today, along with some education. And that education should lead to your understanding of how ESOPs might work in your particular situation, and then leading to commitment and support to actually execute an ESOP within your companies. So that's kind of why I'm here and why I'm so thrilled to be here addressing you folks this morning. Let me introduce CPI now, Chatsworth Products. We're outbirth of a publicly held company called Harris Corporation. We divested from Harris in 1991. The company prior to that was founded in 1952. We don't go back 100 years or 120 years, but back to 1952 is. And it was a post-World War II type of a company, and King Drake, who founded the company, had all kinds of gyrations for the first 20 years and sold it in 1970 to a company called Farallon Electric. And Farallon Electric is where I kind of come in. I was with Farallon during the 70s and transitioned to the Dracon division, which is the founding of the company. Dracon became part of Farallon Electric through an acquisition. And in 1980, Farallon Electric was acquired by Harris Corporation. So that's how we kind of go through the timeline of what took place to get to CPI being a divestiture in 1991. Now, why divest? What was going on within Harris? Well, Harris was a large publicly held company in the high-tech area. Semiconductors, controllers, lots of high-tech stuff. They were, the black boxes, which are actually orange on the airplanes. That's a Harris item. They were doing stuff on satellites. Anyway, we had a metals and plastics business and tools. We were doing some impact tools in the telephone industry. And we had a vision. We created a strategic business unit in 1988. As a subset of our Dracon division of Harris Corporation, and wanted to get into the computer area. It's kind of a growth area. We wanted to transition beyond just the telephone area, and telephone had gone through quite an upheaval with the R box. We broke up AT&T and so forth. We saw this opportunity in the computer area, and we wanted to take our product line, which was all the passive equipment that you currently see in your computer rooms, the racking systems, the cabinet systems, the cable channel, manages the cable in the room, all that is manufactured by our company. Harris Corporation didn't want us to do that. I mean, that wasn't in their line of thinking as to where their core products and core markets would reside. So that made us considered to be a non-core business. When you're a non-core business in a publicly held company, guess what happens? You're eligible for divestiture. In fact, you're divested, and they'll do that as soon as they can, and rightfully so, because they want to take their assets and apply them to their core business. So anything that detracts from that is taken away really from the purpose of the company. So we went through a round of negotiations, and I got the chance to negotiate with my boss. And of course, we ended up with an impasse. But what we ended up with was an option to purchase the business in 1990. And it was a 2-year option. We actually were able to execute that after 1 year. And did so on very favorable terms, because part of our option was that as we worked for Harris Corporation, part of the profitability, if we had any, would go toward the purchase price. And the purchase price was going to be based on the net asset value of the assets that we acquired. So, and we paid a little premium over the asset value. So this got us thinking about working together, and we already had a philosophy of we're all in this together. So we took that philosophy and we really put it to work. I mean, we were already feeling like we worked as a team, as kind of a family organization within this big structure of Harris Corporation. And we just started communicating with the folks on what is it that we're trying to achieve here. What we're trying to achieve is we want to create our own destiny. We want to purchase the company on the best terms that we can. And so to do that, let's all work together. Let's not buy more equipment because we're going to have to pay for that at a premium when we finally execute the option. So let's do with what we can. Let's be profitable. Let's think of good ideas to improve our productivity and efficiency, make sure that the quality is enhanced with what we do, and pay particular attention to our customers because we're in business to serve our customers. So as a team, we reported out monthly on our progress toward actually executing the option agreement. We had lots of problems, barriers, not because of the way the company was operating, but because of the economy in general. We can relate to that now because just think of the economy we're coming out of now. I would like to be in the financial industry or in some of the even the tech areas that are finally starting to rebound. Well, if you go back to 1990, we had Desert Storm, and we had the S&L crisis. The banks stopped lending, and we needed financing in order to execute this purchase. And even though the banks loved us and loved our performance, they weren't lending any money at that time. So we tabbed the banks as being piggy banks rather than banks. And Russ can relate to that because you put the money in, but you can't get the money out. So we went through a period of figuring out where are we going to get this financing. We finally found, and this is to educate on whatever the barrier is, if you want your goal to be achieved, you'll figure out a way to get it achieved, and it takes the right team to do that. Our valuation firm, because we had a valuation done during 1990 thinking we were executing our deal, found the financial institution. We're in Chatsworth, California. He found the financial institution in Washington, D.C. And we made the deal happen. So that's where you're going to see a little bit of. So with that, the employees, we had about 90 employees. Well, we had 90. It wasn't about. We had 90 employees. And we did a limited public offering. What that entails is you can have up to 35 unaccredited investors. You have to go through the ordeal of an offering meeting where we had our employees and their spouses attend. And that meeting is a horrible meeting. It tells them all the reasons they should not invest in the company. Right? There's no guarantee you're going to have customers in the future. There's no guarantee you'll have credit extended by your suppliers. There's no guarantee you're going to have financing from your bank. It's all the negatives. Boom, 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 boom. After that, you're saying, well, would you like to invest? And so, in fact, we ended up finding investment from the employees. The terms from the bank was you need to raise $1 million of equity, and if you can do that, we'll loan you $1.2 million in ESOP financing and extend $1 million line of credit to you. And in fact, when we finished this, the bank increased the leveraged ESOP to $1.5 million from the $1.2 million. So how do we do that? Well, 90 employees, you got to raise $1 million. Where do you find $1 million among production workers and a few management? Well, we found that there was this kitty in our IRAs, 401ks actually. It was in our 401k, Harris 401k. And we, through our general counsel and our ESOP administrator, designated administrator, soon to be administrator, found this potential tool of using self-directed IRAs that would come from our 401k plans. And those self-directed IRAs would invest those dollars into CPI stock. It had to be done before we were actually employees of CPI because there's some rules about not investing in your own company with 401k dollars. And so we got all the right people in putting these plans together, and we're able to execute it. And as far as we know, we are the first to do the rollover 401k into self-directed IRAs and the purchase of stock to create that initial equity. We raised $1,052,000. So we got to our goal over $1 million. The bank was delighted, loaned us the $1 million, and through that you create an ESOP trust. That comes from the bank. The IRAs were on their own. They were kept out of the ESOP until we paid off the bank, which was in 1998. Then those shares were also rolled into the trust. So currently, all 100% of ESOP, all 100% of CPI shares are contained within the CPI ESOP trust. And as was explained earlier, the loan from the bank is actually, there's a mirror loan. The company got a loan from the bank. The company loaned the money to the ESOP on a mirror transaction. It looks like the exact same loan goes to the ESOP. The ESOP uses that money to purchase the shares of the company, and those are housed then in the trust. The trust contains all the shares, and as the bank's loan was repaid, the suspense shares, which were sitting in the trust at that point, get released to the employees' accounts. And we allocate based on compensation for the year. So we look at all eligible compensation, and each employee's percentage of the total compensation is the percentage of the shares that they get that are released each year. And that's how all this stuff works. And not to get into all the mechanics of it, but basically 41% of the company came through the investment by the employees, and 59% of the equity of the company came from the bank doing the ESOP leveraged loan. Now the question might be, why do an ESOP? What kind of craziness is this? It was certainly not something that was in vogue in 1990, 1991. Typically you did an MBO, right? A management-led buyout. And that's where we started. And I have kind of a financial background, so that was kind of my leaning. And I was reading an article, and I believe it was in a CFO magazine. And it started talking about this tool called an ESOP. And talked about the tax benefits, and talked about how everyone shares in the company's ownership, and therefore shares in the wealth that's created, and how it creates alignment, because what benefits the company benefits the employees, and vice versa. And so I got intrigued and started studying about ESOPs, and it was a perfect tool for us because of that family culture we already had, and that philosophy of we're all in this together just made the ESOP kind of a natural choice, and that's why we ran with it, and we're sure glad we did. So you're going to hear a lot about technical stuff. And when I first started studying ESOP, you have all this technical issues that you have to be concerned about. You have evaluation, you have special accounting treatment, there's a contra equity account because of an ESOP, and all this craziness was there. My advice is ignore all that technical stuff. When you're making your decision, do it because it's the right thing for your company, that you want your employees to be engaged in the company as owners in the company and share in the wealth that they're going to create. And then get your team of experts, just as we had to have a team of experts to execute our transaction. And without that, we wouldn't have been successful. You get your team of experts, and they're great outside folks who are part of the family when all is said and done. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about your legal advisor, somebody who should have knowledge and have practiced putting in ESOPs. An ESOP plan administrator, who's going to take care of those accounts and make sure they're managed correctly. Who's going to do your evaluation? Should be somebody who's not just American Appraiser certified, but is in fact someone that engages in ESOP type valuations because it's a special thing. And so you just engage a team that is qualified to handle all those technical things. If you don't handle the technical things well, you're going to get screwed up in your ESOP. But if you hire the right experts, all the technical stuff is going to be fine. Then the problem is, what are you going to do with your ESOP? And there you need to communicate with your employees, because they're now the owners in the company also. And have a serious discussion about roles and responsibilities, because one of the first things we found is, there's this, gosh, I'm the owner, here's what my pay should be. Here, here's the decisions I should be making, and so forth. Going through that discussion of how the company is managed and the roles and responsibilities of individuals is extremely important. Along with that, it's important, if you want to gain the full benefit of an ESOP, to engage the employees in what we call participative management. And what that's defined to be for us is take your work area, Mr. Joe employee, and that is now your domain. You take responsibility for your work area. We expect you to do the right things. We trust you to make the right decisions. And then let them do it. Don't look over their shoulder. Don't have the perennial problem of supervisors doing too much close supervision. Employees are smart, especially when it comes to the areas of their competency. And so as management, I think one of our responsibilities is to let them do their job, get out of their way. And that's part of participatory management. If you really want to get the maximum benefit from your ESOP, then you need to engage your employees and let them think and act as owners, because they are owners. And you'll get significant benefit for having done that. So some incredible things happened when we did our transaction. We did this limited offering, 44 employees. Most of it was the self-directed IRAs, raised $1 million, 41% equity. Did the $1.5 million loan, but this bottom part was the surprise. We had 4 employees out of the 44 that participated, and 3 of them were very close to retirement. They were in their 60s already. I tried to talk them out of making some significant investments. They're near retirement. Don't screw up your nest egg. This is gambling money. This is a new enterprise. We're going into a new market, lots of risk. And only one of these was a senior manager in the company. It was our production manager. The other 2, one was a mold maker, and the other was a senior design engineer. The senior design engineer, I think, was 66 at the time. He was and all of them were committed to staying with the company through the payoff of the leveraged loan. They wanted to see all the shares distributed. I say, okay, guys, I got the mold maker and the senior engineer, who are kind of 2 peas in a pod anyway, together, and I started talking to them about the risk to their retirement of investing in our company. And they looked at me and they said, Joe, we've worked here for 30 years. Don't deny us the opportunity to invest in our own company. This is why we're here. And I was sold, and they, fortunately for them, they came out smelling like a rose when all is said and done, and are living a retirement life now that's well beyond anything they would have imagined in 1990 when we were constructing this. So what's the history here? We had a very exciting company in the 80s. This is the metals and plastics business. It excludes tools because tools in our divestiture were carved out. That happened to be a very high profit, patented product line. And so decided not to allow us to keep the good stuff. And they gave us what they thought to be the bad stuff, metals and plastics. So injection molding plastic and bending metal doesn't sound like a lot of rocket science. And they were more than happy to depart with that part of the business. That part of the business had done nothing. We were pretty much a subservient to the electronics part of the division, which was located in another site, and we were doing housings for test sets. If you know, a lineman has this thing looks like a telephone hanging off their belt, and it's a piece of test gear, and we were doing the plastic housing for that. And we did metal housings for power supplies and various electronics that were built in this other location. So the outside sales, which is what this bar chart represents, were pretty minuscule and not really very exciting for recruiting, nor for showing a bank about how you're going to drive to new higher levels. But the bank believed in us, and they did it by actually walking our floor and understood that we wanted to take a dead market, if you will. The telephone industry market really wasn't growing very much, and take our products, move them into this new marketplace, and that we saw success by doing that. So what was the reality? What happened? Here's what happened. Here's 92. That's kind of the end of the bar chart that you saw on the previous slide. And we grew the company, and you'll see this little dip here. Some things were going on. Here in 99, we had explosion took place, actually started in 98 and into 99, with the Y2K activity. Everybody remember oh my goodness, the world's going to come to an end, our legacy systems are going to die, all those COBOL programs are going to suddenly explode and so forth. And so there was this mass rush to transition from legacy systems to the client server systems. Now that transition had been going on. We were riding the wave of that transition here. That's the market that we focused on. But it just exploded here. And then they compounded that in 2000 when all of these companies came out and the internet craze came out, and if you had an idea for an internet activity, you got money. Just absolute craziness. And data server farms became in vogue. What is server farms? You took a building, and if you could find enough power to drive servers, you filled that building with servers. Guess what those servers were mounted on? Our stuff. And so we rode that crest all the way up here. And then, does everybody remember the dot-com bust? And yeah, we shared in that too. And had it not been for our employee ownership and all of the values that had been laid, we would not have survived that kind of a dip. But because of that, and because of the commitment of all the employees to persevere through these very tough times, we were able to manage through that. And that includes workforce reductions, significant workforce reductions, 2 plant closings. Very, very tough to stomach. I mean, this is hard work, really hard work. This is emotionally draining. This is, it's hard work and very, negative in terms of what you go through emotionally. But you survive it because the employees are dedicated to the survival of the company. I retired here. We got ourselves turned around. I had a little health issue and retired at the end of 2004, knowing that we were in good place and feeling that I had a strong bench for succession planning. And the company started growing again. And here we had this little dip from last year. You know, the economy went a little bit sour in the high-tech area. You know, our Cisco friends, I follow Cisco, and find if Cisco, you know, they got their routers and all the stuff that gets mounted on our stuff. And they're now back growing again. And so, so this is pretty extraordinary because we caught a new market evolving at a very early stage. This is all organic growth, no acquisitions contained in here. So it can be done. And I can tell you lots of stories of people who told me different things could not be done all the way through this. You know, somebody said, Joe, you can grow the company. At this point, we were growing 30% compounded annually through 2000. And I was told back in here, you're not going to be able to continue this growth. You can't sustain it because you won't find the management that you need and you won't find the financing that you need. Well, not only did we find the financing, we actually were buying buildings. Decided we didn't want to pay rent for the rest of our lives. So whatever the barrier is, I assure you, if you have a commitment from the employees and a sound product and market, you're going to be successful. You'll conquer all those barriers. It's all about your commitment and the alignment of your employees to the success of the company. So what did it do to our share price? Here's a kind of a crazy chart. We started, it was $4 a share. And we grew at over to here, it's 22%. At this point, it was way over 22% compounded annually. But 22% compounded annually through 2008, 2009's valuation isn't available yet, isn't a bad compounded growth rate, is it? And I didn't put, I think there's an S&P thing, but you can't see it here. I think Mike showed some of the comparative. Basically, the stock market does nothing, right? It's been kind of flat, at least for the last 10 years. We have some very wealthy people who have retired from CPI. We have some people that, you know, reached well above $1 million in their reward, if you will, for what they achieved. Those two retirement folks, they both got well over $1 million for the one guy had invested $75,000, the other guy had invested $125,000. So they made well over 10 times their investment in the company. And that's what employee ownership is all about. It's wealth creation shared with those who create the wealth. Okay, so the keys for an ESOP success. First of all, you have to have trust. If you don't have trust throughout your company, you can forget about employee ownership. It's not going to work. So if you don't have the trust, you better do a cultural, pulse and put some plans into place to gain trust throughout your company. You need teamwork. And I talk about teamwork, caring, and commitment. Those are the elements of teamwork success. When people work together, they conquer anything that's put in front of them. If they have conflict and are not put on the same side of the rope, you have nothing but chaos. Expertise. You need to have the right people in the right place on your bus. And not only that, you need to have the outside folks, your advisors and the experts that I talked about earlier, also have the right expertise to execute an ESOP transaction and do it effectively. Creativity. You're always going to have barriers where the normal type of solution doesn't apply. It won't work. So don't stop there. Think of something else. Put the creative juices. Think out of the box. Because you have kind of a novel approach when you involve all of your employees in the ownership of the company. So take advantage of those juices. You'll find employees that will absolutely walk the plank for you because they are so committed to the company themselves. That, of course, depends on you having the right people on the bus. And have a can-do spirit. As CEOs, your employees watch you every day and every time they happen to pass by you. Are you frowning? Are you smiling? Is your pace An upbeat pace is your pace kind of a downbeat pace. They sense all of that. If you have that upbeat spirit, if you have that can-do attitude, employees will sense that and they feed off of that. It's a very powerful thing you possess as a CEO. Okay, that's going to be Dick. Okay, I had some wrap-up stuff here because Joe wanted to make sure I caught some things. How am I doing on time, Joe? Am I all right? Joe wanted me to address a few things, so I will do that. First was what's the relationship between the ESOP and the other incentives? So let me talk a little bit about the Chatsworth incentive program, and just as a story. I thought it was important to differentiate the ESOP from other forms of compensation, because ESOP to me is ownership, it's not compensation. So in our incentive plans for compensation incentive, I believe you need short-term incentives and you need mid-term, I'll call them, type incentives. So in the longer-term, mid-term incentives, we had what we call a performance unit plan. And basically it said, what is the return on the debt and equity of the company over a period of time, which we used a rolling 5 years. And how does that compare to what your expectations are? If you overachieve those expectations, a part of that overachievement is a reward to management. And that was kept at the senior level of the company, because the senior level of the company makes those long-term strategic decisions. It's part of their role and responsibilities to do that. So we had that as a longer-term type compensation plan. Then we had an annual operating plan that had an incentive. Management had a incentive, what we call the management incentive plan, which was as you overachieved the plan for the year, a part of those overachievements went to management. And then after that, we had a profit sharing plan. That was very unique because after we took out everything with the exception of our ESOP allocation and our taxes, that pre-tax number we would take 10% of. And every employee would receive the same check from that profit sharing. So we took 10% of the pre-tax, pre-ESOP number, took 10% of that and cut a check to every employee for the same amount. And that's pretty unusual. People usually, you do it by the amount of compensation and so forth. We said everybody's already been compensated. We already earned what we're supposed to earn for the position we have in the company. And now we have some additional money that we want to share. We just want to share that with everybody. And some of those checks, I remember one year we had over $4,000 that went to every single employee. So if you think of a shop worker who's making, at that time, probably about $22,000, $25,000, and you hit them with a $4,000 profit sharing check, you don't think that creates some excitement? And it's the right thing from our culture. It was the right thing to do, and we continue to do that today. So, distinguishing in the benefits area, ESOP I put in the ownership bucket, and other incentive compensation plans are in the compensation bucket. Not every company does that. It's in your bailiwick to decide how you want the ESOP treated. A lot of companies look at an ESOP as additional compensation. It's a norm, actually, that's the way it's considered. So CPI is kind of out of the norm in the way we focus on ESOPs being ownership, and we focus on the equity part of things rather than on the compensation part of things. Benefits and drawbacks of an ESOP. The first thing is an ESOP is incredibly flexible. And that surprises people because they're like all these technical rules and regulations and things you have to comply with and so forth. What I found is if you can envision, if you can put down what your goal is with the ESOP, what you would like it to achieve, the rules are such that you can put a plan into place that will achieve it. Then all you have to do is execute the plan. Where things get kind of crazy is when you have not laid out a vision of what you want the ESOP to achieve. And in that case, it's like not having a succession plan. It's kind of, what was that Yogi Berra expression? If you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going to get there. Employee participation is extremely important. So if you have no plans to engage your employees in participatory management, you're probably going to find some hiccups in trying to execute an ESOP. On the other side, though, you engage your employees, and if you're transparent and open with your employees and communicate the good news and also acknowledge and communicate the bad news, keep them informed, you'll get a wonderful return for having done that. And most importantly, you have to be totally committed to employee ownership. If a CEO is not totally committed to employee ownership, you shouldn't go there. It cannot succeed without your leadership. And the fact that you're engaged in this session would say that this is probably a group of CEOs that would do that. There are a lot of CEOs who want an ESOP because they hear about the tax benefits and they hear about some good things about what it can achieve in liquidity and so forth, but they don't understand the horror stories they're about to face by trying to implement an ESOP without having considered all these cultural aspects of what takes place within the company. An ESOP does not cure a bad market. It doesn't cure a bad business structure. It's not a panacea for success. Testimony to that, look at our friends at UAL. We have the Tribune example. We have lots of examples of public companies especially that tried to turn a bad egg into something good. And in some cases you just aren't going to be able to turn lemons into lemonade without the proper structure, the proper market, proper products to deliver to the market. So keep that in mind, that it takes a good situation and enhances the performance of that good situation. Trying to turn around a bad situation that's inherently poor, an ESOP cannot cure. Those are just fundamental problems with the business. Dick's going to show you a slide on the number of ESOPs that have turned over. We've created like 40,000 ESOPs, and there's only like 11,000 that exist. Why is that? And we did a study, and this is the foundation, sponsored a study by the National Center for Employee Ownership, which is housed right in Oakland. And we were curious, what's going on? Well, what we found is it's a good story. That what happens is the successful ESOPs are actually being purchased at substantial premiums to their appraised value. And they get an offer that is called too good to refuse. And so they sell out. Now, there's another side to that, which is those companies that are selling out for a premium never realize the true value of their company and never put in place the succession plan that would allow that ESOP to be sustained in the future. And so the easy way out is you sell, and you sell at a premium. Now you'll hear a lot of folks talk about repurchase liability as being a real downside. Repurchase liability is an issue. It's an issue especially if your company is in a tough financial situation, like what we went through when 50% of our market collapsed between 2000 and 2002. We went through some very tough times on repurchase liability and a lot of other things. The repurchase liability was simply symptomatic of all those other things. It was tough business at the time. But you can manage your way through that if you're committed to doing it. The repurchase liability is a cash flow item. If you have a good CFO is going to plan your cash needs. And the repurchase liability becomes a part of those cash requirements. The ESOP works like a continuous exit plan for your business. Instead of having, one large shareholder or 2 or 3 large shareholders and having to deal with their exit plans, the ESOP creates an environment where you have a continuous exit plan. And you don't have to start paying out for 5 years if you choose to do that, or you can start paying out immediately if you choose to do that. Just depends what you put into your plan as your method for repurchase. So there's a lot of flexibility. There are a lot of obstacles that have to be dealt with. But the ESOP, when all said and done, can enhance the performance of your company, create wealth that's absolutely beyond anything you might imagine, because you're going to take all your employees and make them owners in the company. They're going to become capitalists in our country, and some of them are going to be entrepreneurial and actually create whole new areas for you that you never would have thought would have existed. So that's my spiel. Good. Okay?
What I think I'll do is walk you through a few of the basics, but very quickly, because you've gotten everything. This will be a review. And so, okay.
Just go, that goes forward right there.
Okay.
Can everyone hear back there?
Am I coming through okay? Yeah. Okay, so I think you know what an ESOP is. It buys the stock of a sponsoring company. It can buy it from the company or from the shareholder. It is a qualified plan, so there are benefits for the selling shareholder. There's at least capital gains treatment, and if the plan owns 30% after the transaction, you can get a 1042 treatment, which is the rollover that was discussed. And you can borrow to purchase employer securities. And by the way, that was kind of a unique thing back in 1956 when Lou Kelso, a corporate lawyer in San Francisco, was retained by a newspaper. And they were trying to sell the newspaper, but the owners of the newspaper loved their employees. It had become a second family. They said, figure out a way so the employees could buy the company. And Lou did a lot of investigation. He had just written a book with Mortimer Adler called The Capitalist Manifesto, where these two guys at some cocktail party in Pacific Heights had talked about Karl Marx really being a capitalist. He just really wanted to have people own things. Well, that book became a bestseller. And so Adler and Kelso wrote another book, The New Capitalist, and that became a bestseller. But Kelso had this feeling that there must be some way for people that help build a company to not be thrown on the ash heap when the company sold, and to make the rich richer. And so he went to the Internal Revenue Service and he took a device that's been in the code since 1922 called the stock bonus plan, and he got a private letter ruling that stock bonus plan could borrow money. And so therefore they converted the money that was in the profit sharing plan to a stock bonus plan, a bank loaned money to the stock bonus plan, and the first ESOP was created. And it became very successful. And Lou spent 15 years going through 3 or 4 law firms to put 6 ESOPs in. And it just so happened that one of our clients put the 7th ESOP in, and one of my associates had introduced Lou to the CEO of our client firm, and the 7th ESOP was born. And when I saw the plan and trust, I couldn't believe it. I sent it to the legal department of the financial institution I represented, and the head lawyer called me back and said, this is nothing new, this is just a stock bonus plan that borrowed money. No big deal. Well, it was a big deal, because I saw how that company behaved in contrast to all the companies we had as clients. And ultimately, I ended up selling all the parts of my financial services company that did not deal with ESOPs in '75 and started to focus on ESOPs. So that leveraged ESOP, that was one of the first. But I was very careful about leverage because 2 or 3 years later, that company got into real trouble. They didn't manage the repurchase liability properly. People would leave. They'd give checks to them, and pretty soon a lot of people were leaving. And then the bank called the line of credit. And then I had to go on the board of this company to try to fix the ESOP. There's no better way to learn something to fix a broken, ESOP. And we finally got things straightened around, and we did the first repurchase liability study, and we set up a funding program so that in the future there'd be money to handle that repurchase liability, and then the company did very well. The characteristics of a good ESOP company, and when I give a talk, I typically talk about all the reasons you shouldn't have an ESOP. I don't talk about why you should have, because those numbers are very real, and that 40,000 ESOPs was taken from a survey done in 2003 when I co-authored an article called ESOPs, a Four-Letter Word, and at that time there were 40,000 that had gone in, and at that time there were 10,000. Well, here we are. 7 years later, there's 11,500. We tracked back how many ESOPs had gone in every year. A lot of them had gone in. And as Joe indicated, one of the big reasons for an ESOP being taken out is that the company sold. And so we did the same kind of research that the Ownership Foundation did, and we found out the same thing, that the reason that those companies are sold is because there's no successor management. And the people running the company were chained to the oars. They couldn't get out. So the only way to get out is to sell the company. Many times the employees made out very well in their ESOP accounts, and their jobs were secure. Many times that was not the case. So owners willing to transfer ownership, that's the first thing. Well, a lot of people are willing to transfer ownership if you give them tax-free money, and the company can deduct the contributions to the plan. It becomes a tax shelter. Unfortunately, too many ESOPs are put in that way. And then people wake up later and say, wait a minute, there's some things I didn't know, like the put. How does that work? And so it's important that you, before you do that you have a strong management team that's either internal or you build it before you put the ESOP in. The ESOP itself will not build the management team. That takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of leadership training. If you don't have a demonstrated record of profitability, unless you have the kind of vision that Joe Cabral had, that we could become very profitable if we got everyone on board and got the thinking time of all of our associates, we typically don't recommend that. If there's not cash flow to cover the ESOP contributions and other debt, don't go into it. And don't leverage the company too heavily with the ESOP transaction, because you could run into rough times, and the put contract and the current leverage means that you're going to struggle in order to survive. So those are things we look at in feasibility studies. And you have to have an adequate payroll, meaning you have to have a large enough payroll to be able to warrant the contribution. There are limits to the contribution you can make to cover the transaction that you have in mind. And then we've talked about the culture, and that's the most important thing of all, and that's been heavily covered here, so I won't even get into that. But I'll remember one case in Hawaii, and one of the executives here at the college is from Hawaii, and I was playing golf at Waialae Country Club with Thurston Twigsmith, who was the publisher of the Honolulu Advertiser, and introduced to me by a man in Hawaii who brought us in for all the ESOP transactions at a big trust company. And we're riding along, and he said, "What do you know about the Bass Brothers?" Well, at the time, in the early 80s, we were representing a company trying to keep the Bass Brothers off the board. I said, "I know quite a bit about the Bass Brothers. What do you want to know?" He said, "Well, they want to buy 1/3 of our company." I said, "How many directors do they want?" He said, 2. I said, "Have you ever had a dissident director?" He said, yeah. The mayor of Honolulu was on our board. It took me a long time to get him off. I said, "He's nothing compared to the Bass Brothers." You're going to find that you probably will want to buy them out. Have you ever heard of the thing called green mail? And he had. So he said, well, I said, why do you want them on your board? Why do you want to sell 1/3 of your company? You're very profitable. He said, I've got 50 family shareholders. They want more than the dividend. I said, well, tell me about the profitability of your company. Well, it was a very profitable company. I said, are you charitable at all? Major donors to Punahou, to Yale. The corporation itself gave 10% of its gross earnings to charity. I said, well, let me tell you about a plan where you could maybe, for a period of time, have the 10% of your gross earnings go to a trust that we create, family trust, for the benefit of your second family. Because you got 50 people that belong to your family, but you have a second family that have helped build your company. Well, this guy was philanthropic not only for outside, but his employees loved him. Make a long story short, we designed an ESOP that could buy not 1/3, but it could buy a hefty percentage. And about that time, the tax law changed in '84, and Section 1042 was adopted by the Congress. And I had to call them and tell them, look, if we could bump the percentage ownership up to 30% of the company, then the sale by your shareholders to the ESOP could be rolled over, buy some bonds, borrow on the bonds, buy real estate, buy stock, whatever you want to do. He said, well, how do we do that? I said, your payroll is not big enough, not adequate. He said, so how do we increase the payroll? I said, well, we could acquire some other newspapers. So here is a potential ESOP transaction that we put on the shelf, and I started talking to friends of his that had newspapers around the country, and we have finally found a newspaper up in the Northwest, actually a chain, 4 newspapers, and we helped them buy those 4 newspapers. One of them had an ESOP, so we could merge that ESOP with our ESOP, and the additional payroll allowed us to have a 30% ESOP. Now, the CEO of the company, Phil Giulianella, we recruited because he saw we were building a chain, and he was the publisher of the Star Bulletin, and we enticed him to come to us by allowing him to buy some stock at book value from one of the family members that wanted to get out. Now they didn't want to wait for the ESOP. So Phil joined us, and he became the CEO, and my client still remained as publisher. 5 years later, Phil Giulianella was told he had terminal cancer. My client, by that time, was getting a little older. So he called me and he said, I don't want to go back and run this thing. By that time, we had 12 newspapers, and it was a big operation. He said, Gannett would like to buy us, but they only want to buy just the Honolulu Advertiser. So I shuttled back and forth to the islands for about 6 months. We finally decided we'd be willing to sell, but we'd have to get a private letter willing to bifurcate the parent company into 2 parent companies. One with the Honolulu Advertiser, one with everything else. And then we'd do a tax-free exchange merger with the new parent company and Gannett. And it was publicized in the paper, so there's nothing secret about it. But we valued the newspaper at $110 million, about 7 years earlier. The merger took place at $250 million of Gannett stock. Now, why? Because we had built not only the Advertiser, but all of the other papers by going to the publisher of the Marin Independent Journal and showing him an ESOP account if he would move up and take control of our Northwest media. And he saw that over a period of 10 years, if our stock continued to grow the way we expected it to, he'd have a lot more than the benefit plan he had with Gannett. And we did that to attract publishers all over the country. Now, we couldn't let him keep this projection. We'd have to say, this is what we think it's going to be, because you cannot project what's happening. But because we attracted the brightest and best publishers of these papers, we built a big operation. So that's what adequate payroll means. Sometimes people have to go out and acquire companies in order to get a big enough payroll to develop the tax-free rollover, and that motivates some people. The non-leverage plan and the leverage plan. For years, I would tiptoe into a leverage transaction because I'd seen what happened to this first company that got over-leveraged. And it wasn't really until 1984 and getting to the 30% ESOP that made a big difference to a lot of people that I switched from my preference for the progressive ESOP, where you start out and the chairman of the company says to the employees, the first contribution comes from the board. It's going to buy stock in the company. After that, the contributions will depend upon you. And if the stock grows fast enough, the board may make a second contribution. And so the people then start working toward getting more contributions, and the stock is sold at the fair market value at each year. And it gradually grows. And that way, if the company finds out they can't communicate the ESOP with people, the wrong culture is being created, they don't have the right management, we can unwind the ESOP while it's still small and roll it back into a profit-sharing plan. And we do a lot of that because it's not right for everyone. Not every stockholder feels that the employees are really a second family. They really look upon them as employees. And that's just the facts of life. Those ESOPs do not last. We can't know that in advance. So the non-leveraged ESOP has shareholders selling to the ESOP or the company to benefit the employees. And that's a pretty straightforward deal. The leveraged ESOP, you've just seen how that works. And that's covered in my book. The advantages for the company, significant tax savings. From a C Corp at 40% to 100% for an S Corp. Now, Joe has an S Corp that is integrated with rollovers from money that people had the option to either roll over or not. He has a skin in the game, 100% S Corp ESOP. There are other ESOPs that become 100% that are all, contributions and no one has put a dime into them, and they're effective and they're successful. There are a lot of 100% ESOPs that are successful with this management team, and then the new management is recruited, and they say, wait a minute, I want more than an ESOP account, and pretty soon that management's negotiating with a private equity group to sell out. So increasingly, there are more and more large ESOPs being sold because the successor management didn't feel the same way as the first management. So the succession plan, you had a different culture in management the second time than you did the first time or the third time. There's a significant increase in cash flow if you are using your own stock to make a contribution and using the tax savings to increase your cash flow. Pre-tax dollars, we've already talked about that. Now, the C Corporation dividends being deductible, that was a big deal. And in 1984, Senator Long, when he announced this legislation, he said, we want to be able to talk to our employees in the language of long green. So one of the members of the ESOP Association had a practice of having a kind of a phantom dividend. He'd look at the stock that was owned by everyone in the company and then make out checks for bonuses based upon the amount of stock the person had in their account, and that's a deductible bonus. But he said it would sure be great if I could just pay the dividend and pass it through to the employees. And so Senator Long thought that was a great idea, and that was in the code, and that stayed in the code. This is a major deal. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued a no-action letter in the early 70s, and that was about the time that ERISA took what had been the requirement of getting a private letter ruling for every ESOP, and they formalized the ESOP in ERISA so that it's now you can get a letter of determination on a plan based upon a law that says if it's set up this way, you can get your letter. But for companies that have a lot of employees and that are worried about all of the registration requirements, if you go above a certain number of employees and you're in that world of I guess, almost registration.
500 is a limit.
Yeah.
We're not there.
But
we're very conscious of that.
Right, exactly right. There's far more paperwork, far more disclosure, far more everything when you have more than a certain number of employees, and every state has a little bit of a different requirement. But the SEC issued a no-action letter, and Bob Fries, who later became general counsel at Kelso Company when I was chairman, Bob Fries was with the SEC, and he wrote the no-action letter to state that the trust is one shareholder. That means that once the 84 law went in, there was a little provision called 2210, which we had drafted, and which got put into the law, and that meant that you could close an estate by transferring stock equivalent to the estate tax on that stock to an estate. The estate would get the 14-year financing under 6166 that a farm would get. Hallmark Cards put an ESOP in. Cargill put an ESOP in. The Honolulu Advertiser didn't worry anymore about the ESOP because they had an estate tax benefit. They could pay their estate taxes with company stock. The ESOP could take that stock and get 14 years of time from the Internal Revenue Service to pay it off, and the corporation would make a tax-deductible contribution to the ESOP. It was a perfect world. But unfortunately, it had a sunset. And so that's not in the code anymore. So we have to kind of work around it. We figured out a way to do it, but it's still possible to have your estate pay estate taxes with company stock. The advantages for the shareholder: liquidity, control. When Joe called me and he said, find out from some of the associates of private capital, and since we've been in business a long time, and for a period of time we owned the company that invented ESOPs, the leveraged stock bonus plan, I went to the person who has been affiliated with us the longest, and he gives talks every year. And Ron Gilbert, I said, Ron, you give talks before groups all the time. I do it very seldom anymore. Tell me what questions people have when you've finished. He said, well, the first thing is control. Who's going to run this company? How secure is the board of directors of that company once they make that decision that the employees are not going to like what that board's doing, and they'll own enough stock so they can get at least a director on that board? And they changed the law so that there's a forced vote pass-through, and the employees get to vote that stock whether they do today or not. The law changes. That's their biggest concern. I said, what's the second biggest concern? He said, what's wrong with an ESOP? It can't be that good. Well, we've been talking about what's wrong with an ESOP here, what you have to do to prepare your company to have an ESOP. So let's talk a little bit about control. If it were mandated that all of the employees of an ESOP, participants, would be able to vote for the board of directors at the outset, there would be a shrinking of new ESOPs. Many ESOP companies elect later, once they're mature, once they have a dispersion of stock, once they have a culture created, they don't mind passing the vote through. And Joe Cabral has that position. However, in '76, after the securities lawyer that used to be a partner with Kelso and Company joined me, and we created a Private Capital Corporation and changed our name from the very sexy Buxton Associates to Private Capital Corporation. Our first client as a combined company was in North Carolina, and it was a mechanical contractor, Air Conditioning Corporation. And my partner went in to go over the plan and trust, and I went along with him. And we described how the culture could be built, and how I'd handle the communication, and how as a director of several ESOP companies, and that would be helpful. And so the CEO of the company said, we're a non-union company. We have 200 employees. Under what circumstances can the union decide that they want to organize us by organizing all these 200 people to vote in a particular way so that they can dominate our board? I said, well, first of all, they'll only vote the shares if you want them to. Otherwise, a committee will instruct a trustee appointed by the board of directors who appoints the committee as to how to vote those shares. And at that time, there was no exceptions. In '78, there became some exceptions. In '84, some exceptions. In '86, some exceptions. So now there's 7 exceptions to that rule, but mostly dealing with reorganization, recapitalization, sale of assets, that type of thing. We still sell companies, and the employees don't vote on that because we sell the stock in the company and we get an outside trustee, and the employees get value and outside people determine its value. So he said, okay. He went forward to the ESOP. Now comes the communication. It's at the Holiday Inn, downtown Greensboro. And I come in, and I have to show my ID to an armed guard. And I walk in, and there are 4 entrances to this room with about 300 or 400 people coming, because he wanted to have the wives. And everyone was in that room, and all of them had their ID checked against a list of the employees. And I asked him later, I said, why did you do that? He said, because the union is constantly trying to organize us. I don't want to have a union guy in here that taking notes and then spreading the rumor that we're about to do something that will benefit us and not them. Now, I later found out that North Carolina had the lowest percentage of union companies in the country, followed closely by Texas, and then 18 other right-to-work states. A strange thing happened. Private capital grew by doing most of our business in the right-to-work states, because there's a little provision we put in our plans, and we still do, that if you join a union where collective bargaining deals with retirement benefits, we can exclude those subject to collective bargaining. And so therefore we have a company right-to-work plan. So a vote passed through in certain states where the employees could be convinced by a union to vote a certain way. That's of concern. We've talked about the tax-free roll. It's a tax-deferred rollover. And now we come to something that probably is the reason for us being here. and the development funds, the development managers for charities all over the country have had people like me and my associates speaking. We're doing it for the University of North Carolina Graduate School of Business at the Greensboro campus in August for the same reason. You can gift appreciated stock and get a deduction from your income tax. And there's some limits, 30% of your adjusted gross income. But you got a 5-year forward, a 5-year carry forward, so you can put a lot of money in and then deduct it over a period of 5 years. And that's done all the time. People give appreciated stock to a charity, to a hospital, to a college, to, the YMCA. But if it's a privately held stock, what's that charity do with that stock? Typically, it's bought back by the corporation. And then there'll be an IRS audit. And someone will find out that that was pre-planned, especially since there was a put contract granted, so that when the charity got the money, or got the stock would not be discounted by 50% for lack of market. And the put contract gives you the market at fair market value. So we looked at that and we thought, well, the ESOP is not the corporation. And if we provide the put so that the stock's not depreciated for lack of market, and we do it in such a way that the put is requested by the corporation as a quid pro quo for a right of first refusal on that stock, then maybe we get a legal opinion that this would not this would not be a step transaction. And thus, we'd have a problem with the Internal Revenue Service saying this is a de facto stock redemption, and the money that's been paid by the ESOP is not a deductible item because the corporation is deducting the money to the ESOP, and it's ordinary income to the individual, and that gift was really a way around the taxes. So structuring the gift of an appreciated security that's private, where you want to make a market for that security, is something you do very carefully, and we've been doing it for 30-some-odd years with Stanford for the study of leukemia at their medical school, to Lees McRae College for a chair in mathematics, to a college in upstate New York for a chair in color technology, and just go on and on and on. I've talked about these. The 25 years of studies actually goes back 30 years, and Senator Long had a legislative aide by the name of Jack Curtis. Jack Curtis had been a lawyer with Kelso and Company. I was chairman of Kelso and Company. And Jack Curtis flew out to see me, and he said, Senator Long wants Senate Finance to mandate an ESOP for Chrysler Corporation. If Chrysler Corporation is going to get a loan guarantee, he feels the employees are going to have to take $2 per hour reduction in income, should share on the ownership of Chrysler Corporation. The board of Chrysler Corporation feels that would be dilutive. They feel that the stockholders would rebel at something like that. Even though if they don't get the loan guarantee, there won't be any Chrysler Corporation. Said, Kelso and Company is the pioneer in ESOPs, so can you prove that there's any connection between an ESOP and increased productivity? And so I said, well, you know, I've seen a lot of it. Our people have seen a lot of it. Let's see if I can quantify it. So we had the ESOP Association that had been formed in 1978. The guy that was the first executive director of the ESOP Association is a good friend of mine. I'd recruited him for that job. He liked what we were doing so well that he recruited someone else to run the ESOP Association. He joined us as our general manager, Harry Orchard. When Harry was building the ESOP Association, he went to a great guy by the name of John Menke, who has one of the fine ESOP consulting firms in the country. And I didn't know John at the time, but he'd been a former lawyer of ours, and I knew him by reputation. He was phenomenal. And he had a lot of clients. We had a lot of clients. Harry got the names of all of John Menke's clients. He got the names of all of our clients. He designed a survey, and he sent it out, and only Harry would be able to calculate what came in from that survey. The results of that survey were sent to Senator Long. Senator Long put the results of that survey in an open letter to the New York Times, in the New York Times, saying that if Chrysler will put an ESOP in, we will consider a loan guarantee. And Chrysler had no choice. In order to get their loan guarantee, they had to put the ESOP in. Strange thing happened. Chrysler Corporation did very well, and it grew. And they had a union man on the board. First time in years that a union person had gone on a board. But they had a strike called by the Canadian workers that weren't part of the ESOP. The U.S. workers did not go out on strike, just the Canadian workers. But when the union representative on the board saw that, he became frightened. Whoa, we can't strike this company. And so a year later, he threatened all sorts of things if they didn't take out the ESOP and put in a defined benefit pension plan, which was at the core of what has eventually killed that and health insurance benefits and you know union benefits that killed the auto industry in the United States. And so that's probably the greatest example of before and after. Before ESOP, a failing company. After ESOP, a successful company. Take the ESOP out, a failing company. But that was the first ESOP productivity survey, and the results are in my first book. We've talked about the accumulation of ESOP benefits and the tax-favored distribution. We've talked about dividend income. And how do you keep a company private by having an ESOP? Well, first of all, you can restrict ownership of shares to employees or a trust for their benefit, so that when someone leaves, they've got to sell the stock back. That's legal. Secondly, if you have management buying stock, and we're probably the most outspoken proponents on the balanced ESOP, where most of our clients, if the ESOP gets close to 50%, they get nervous about it, because they want management to have 25 or 30%, and the family wants to maintain some ownership, because after all, the founder and the family may have spent, you know, hundreds of thousands of hours to build this company, and why give it away? And that's good. So I think one of the things I used to talk about is that the three-legged stool concept. If you just have two legs, just the ESOP and the family, well, you better have some very dedicated management with no skin in the game to behave like entrepreneurs and to learn how to be an entrepreneur without putting any money up. But if you have a third leg and people put skin in the game and they watch that money. They put it in. They watch it. Just like Joe watched his money, and there's other people that put money and watch their money, because that 100% ESOP started out with skin in the game. Well, then you have a three-legged stool. And if you get past the 50%, you have 51%. Now, in today's rules, the trust is voted by a committee if you don't want to pass it through. But who knows what may happen in the future, and so a lot of very conservative people stay to 49%. Now, you have a buy-sell agreement, though, with anyone that buys that stock, that if they leave the company has a call, and they buy it back with a subordinated note. You cannot buy your stock back in an ESOP from a subordinated note. It has to be a secured note. And how do you get the security away from the bank and have it pledged to a note? And we used to be able to buy a bond. We can't even buy bonds anymore. So what you have to do is you have to pay cash. You can defer it for 5 years, and then you can give 1/5 a year for 5 years. And if it's an employee-restricted company, they have to sell the stock back. So there's no circumstance under which an outsider can come in and get control of a company if the ESOP is properly structured. On our website, an article written in 2003, ESOP's a four-letter word, goes into why 25% survive. And as Joe indicated, a lot of them, they were sold at a profit. In most cases, because of the humbled advertiser, my 78-year-old client didn't want to go back in and run the company. And Phil Gianella was a gifted person. He didn't think he could find someone like that to run that big a company. So therefore, he sold the advertiser. We helped him do it. And then he sold all the rest of the newspapers, and it became an investment company. And I can tell you story after story after story of where if you don't have someone to step into the shoes and become a visionary, gifted leader, then you're better off selling the company, protecting the employees, and then hoping to negotiate something so those employees continue on with their past service counted and all the other things. If you, that's from one of our private capital studies. You can see that when you first put an ESOP in for 7 or 8 years, not much happening. And then all of a sudden it could become a tsunami. If in those early years, and if right here you weren't putting reserves aside within the company so that this is working, so that when this happens, and if the profits of the company don't permit this to be purchased, you can dip into the reserves. And the reserves can't be in the ESOP. Now, most of them are, because people don't understand the ESOP has no obligation to buy that stock. The company has the obligation to buy that stock under the put contract. So put the funding where the obligation lies. That is a typical ESOP transaction for private capital, but we give you a roadmap. And we tell you, go here, don't go here, or you'll wind up where you were. And there are 40 or 50 different things that have to be coordinated. And just like in a construction project, you make sure that the foundation goes in before you start working on the roof. That's kind of obvious. But a lot of people, don't do that when it comes to designing a complex investment banking transaction on the very private placement. Chapter 9 in my first book is the very private placement. And it happened to be a situation where a big ESOP in that situation, it was a high-tech company growing just like, 45, 50% year-by-year compound growth rate. Someone had recommended a 30% ESOP for this company. They dismissed it out of hand. Their attorney said, I can get you a private placement. You can sell $7 million of your stock. Give up 35% ownership. The board's about ready to do that because they had no idea what the company was worth. A member of our advisory board, and by the way, Joe Cabral is a valued member of our advisory board. People that have had his kind of experience that we like to have advise us. And the member of our advisory board called me and he said, one of my proteges is chairman of the board of a company in Oregon. Would you come up and talk to them? They don't want to think about an ESOP, and yet I think it looks like it could be an ESOP. So I met with them, and they told me about the fact they decided not to have an ESOP because you have to have at least 30%. I said, well, that's if you want to do tax-deferred rollover. You're just growing. I mean, 1% might be a big ESOP for you. And they said, well, we can sell 35% of our company for $7 million in cash. The co-founder was living in his car when he got the backing, and he doesn't want to live in his car again, so he wants to get some money out of the company right now. So that $7 million is very attractive. I said, well, you're going to dilute himself by selling this 35% of his stock? He said, yep. I said, well, okay. What's the company worth? Well, I guess if you take 3 times 7 million, it's probably worth 21 million. I said, where do you get that? He said, well, our attorney says you have to take the offer and take it times 3. So, have you ever heard of a fair market value appraisal? We don't need it. Our attorney said he can take care of it. I said, well, your attorney doesn't do this for a living. Let me bring in an appraiser. The appraiser came in and valued the company that they were trading, they were giving options out at 75 cents a share, and then the attorney thought maybe they'd go to $1.25. The stock was worth $5. But our appraiser said next year probably be worth $10. So we came back, we said, okay, let's put in an ESOP, put cash into the ESOP, let the co-founder sell some of his stock to the ESOP so he can get comfortable, and then next year maybe sell another little bit of stock, because you probably should be going public. But this was a high-tech company, and they had a proprietary tool, and they were going crazy in terms of profitability. They went public at $170 million in 3 years, and yet they were prepared to sell 35% of their company for $7 million because some well-meaning lawyer was in a field he did not know. In other words, legal in an ESOP situation doesn't mean your typical lawyer who is not an ERISA lawyer and a tax lawyer. All the lawyers we deal with have both ERISA, tax law, and securities law. And if they don't have securities law in their law firm, they have a securities lawyer. Because you can run afoul of all 3 of those areas. You have to understand an awful lot about trusts. You have to be able to have an actuarial foundation to any repurchase liability study. Most actuaries charge a lot of money. You should have an independent appraisal. You can use a formula, and as we just heard, this is verified by an appraisal, but SAIC, Science Applications, went to 30,000 employees, and they used the same approach as was described here, but they had an auction market. And so therefore, people were buying stock every quarter with people selling it. So they had a lot of transactions going on. A public supermarket, same thing. You have to be an employee to own stock in public supermarket. They have 100,000 beneficiaries of the largest ESOP in the country with a private company, $1 billion private company, 100,000 plus employees. George Jenkins, the founder of Publix, was a guy I knew back in the 70s and used to play in his golf tournament. And he gave me a copy of his book. And in the book, he's interviewed right after they got pretty big. And the journalist said, Mr. Jenkins, your company is worth $250 million and you only own 40% of it. You could own the whole thing if you hadn't given it away to those employees. And Jenkins responded, wrong. We have 100 and some odd supermarkets. If I hadn't started giving it to the employees, we'd have 1. And that says it all. Jenkins looked upon his employees until he died, and now his son-in-law and his daughter look upon it the same way as their second family. Corporate finance, one of the most important parts of an ESOP transaction, because you're going public internally. And you have to consider everything, as you've heard. Accounting, tax issues, estate planning issues, insurance issues. Be sure you have plenty of errors and omissions or fiduciary liability insurance when you have an ESOP. D&O liability insurance, because there's going to be a case where an employee's going to feel, I was wronged, and they'll go to the Department of Labor, and then you have to defend yourself. So therefore, you need to be insured to pay the cost. So you do nothing, it's a crapshoot. You provide succession planning, it's an investment. Thank you.
Great job. Great job.